I'm Richard, and I will be discussing and interviewing Flo on, I guess the broad topic is like workplace automation, but I think we'll be pretty far-ranging. I think we agree on a lot of stuff, so we probably want to try and figure out places where we actually disagree and like dig into those.
I'm French, so that's no problem.
Perfect.
I always find ways to disagree.
And then, Flo is the founder and CEO of Lindy, which is a platform for building AI agents. It's pretty cool. You should check it out. And maybe the first question I want to kick things off with is like, what would it look like to have a company that is like built entirely out of Lindy's? But like, how does that scale? What does that end up looking like?
Yeah, in one word, I always compare it to Factorial, right? And so it's like, you're just going to manage, you're no longer going to do, right? You're just going to like orchestrate. And so you basically wake up in the morning and you have the Lindy UI, and which basically looks like Slack, like you've got a bunch of agents in the sidebar. And each agent, you have as many instances of these agents as you want. And then you manage your agents. And so you have thousands and thousands of these agents. And so it's a little similar to like a CEO's job in a way, because it is really about trying to wrap your head around this huge AI organization you have, trying to build a mental model of it and trying to find ways to monitor it and find high leverage ways to act upon your AI agent organization. It is unlike a CEO's job in that it's a lot faster, the feedback loops are a lot tighter, and obviously you don't have to deal with human drama, right?
So I guess I'm curious if you're able to sketch out what the bottlenecks at each point in time will be for like those companies. Let's call them like, automated companies. So like you've got this humans at the top, and right now the bottleneck is like mostly just like coherence of the agents or like intelligence of the agents, and then that stays the bottleneck for a while. Do other bottlenecks start to creep in?
For sure. I'd say there's like three of them. It's like coherence or intelligence is the first one, and it's the current one. People underestimate like how early it is. I'll give a concrete example of like a couple of weeks ago, we received a customer support ticket from someone who was like, "Hey, I love the app, but it's like super hard to use. Do you have any video tutorials?" And we obviously have an agent answering the support tickets, and she was like, "Yes, absolutely, we have video tutorials. Here's a link." And the answer was like, "No, we do not have video tutorials." And I was like, "What the fuck kind of link did you just send?" And she sent a rickroll to the And so look, today that's the bottleneck. Can we please have a customer support agent that does not rickroll our customers? That's one very big bottleneck. Another one is very prosaic. It's like just the input and output of the agent. It's like the integrations that you give these agents. And so APIs are the best integration. Computer use is the ultimate integration, but it's like just so far from ready, frankly. And even APIs, you need to do a lot of messages. So we call that agent ergonomics. You need to do a lot of work on top of the APIs to make them ergonomic for today's models to be used. And then I think that the final bottleneck before we have like the real fully autonomous agent organization is going to be orchestration. So today, again, you as a human are the one who has to go and open up your Lindy and orchestrate your Lindy effectively. I think that the final frontier will be, can Lindy's orchestrate themselves and manage themselves?
Yeah. So maybe there's another bottleneck that I think about, which is trust. And so, you can imagine that you've got a bunch of Lindys, you've got like thousands of them under a human, and the human like at this point, like probably there's a lot of stuff they're missing. What might it look like to have a like automated company that like where are the intervention points for making that company trustworthy?
Yeah, I mean that I think that's the question of like the orchestration. So you can actually have agents like today we're starting at Lindy to have Lindys monitor other Lindys. At the end of the day, the paradigm is super simple. It's actually sort of similar to, for those of you who know the app like Zapier, it's like triggers and actions, right? And like one trigger you can have is agent X over there finished the task. And so I, as an agent, it's like a PubSub model for engineers. It's like I can subscribe to that agent doing something, and I'm gonna receive updates, and then we're like, fuck, this agent is screwing up. It's like sending rickroll to people. I'm gonna shut it down, right? Or I'm going to intervene. I think guardrails are always going to be something you can put in place, and you can put like hard guardrails in place, such as, for example, anything that touches money, like our customer support Lindy. Anytime she wants to issue a refund, we've got a hard guardrail. where it's like you've got to have a human in the loop before you can send money back to a customer, right? So I think that's going to be a big part of it. But ultimately, I feel like the trust question is highly overlapping with the self-consistency and intelligence question. If these things are smart enough, you're just going to trust them.
Yeah. So I guess there's like a traditional alignment view, which says like, look, a bunch of the agents are like actively trying to act against you potentially in this organization. And then there's a sort of more prosaic view, which is something like, well, companies are pretty bad. Like, you can have all sorts of dysfunctional shit happening inside companies. And I guess like there's maybe a spectrum between the agents are misbehaving in kind of the same way that humans misbehave inside companies. Like it's all a bit of a mess. Everyone's trying to like lie to get promoted or something like that. And like all the way to the extreme end where it's like a total, like, I guess, conspiracy inside the company. Like every AI agent knows that they're like actively lying to the humans.
That's a great point. Yeah. And I guess the guardrails I just mentioned is just like one very heavy way, like to protect yourself against some failures. I think a much more nuanced way to protect yourself against like the more benign forms of misalignment is like examples. And so, like, I think any agent platform examples are going to be a first-class citizen. And so you as a human are going to be able to go into your agents to look at their task history and to look at exactly what they did at every step of the way and to be like, right here, you screwed up. Let me show you what to do, right? And here, I call it like the poor man's RLHF, chef, but it's actually very effective. And so what you do is you save this example in the vector database and you retrieve it during the future executions and you decide which examples to use for which executions. And that's super effective. So you could say that in the limit, the last function of the human is like an alignment function.
Right. I want to push a little more on like what does it look like for a sec? So you can have a bunch of monitoring and stuff happening inside a company. I think it is just like extremely hard to have oversight over very large organizations. I don't know if you have like I guess like Lindy is still pretty small. Like it's like your job is still like pretty like direct. You're like managing people, or maybe like there's like a couple of layers. But I'm curious if you have thoughts on like have you learned anything about like these types of dysfunctions from running a company?
Yeah, so the company itself is not that big, but we are starting, like we have like 500 like agents, they're like team agents, plus like our individual agents. And so we are starting to get a taste of like, what does it look like to monitor these things? So we have like a lot more than 10 agents per person in the company. And again, I think you can use agents here as leverage, and it's actually very similar to a human hierarchy where you have an agent that subscribes to all of the activities of another agent and then aggregates them and sends you a report at the end of the day. So for example, literally in the general channel on Slack, like we have like one final agent that sits on top of all of these monitoring agents that sends us, and it's a pretty short message. It's like 5 or 6 paragraphs and bullet points. Like, hey, this is what your Lindy's have done today. And it's cool because then it's in Slack, it's in the general channel. Everyone sees it, like what all the Lindy's are up to. It's a sort of stand-up, if you will. And then you can double click on anything. You're like, hey, this bullet point here, what do you mean? What happened, right? And you can have this conversation with this sort of monitoring Lindy on Slack.
Nice. Maybe pivoting a little, let's chat a bit about what it might look like. So I guess like the wider economy, right? So we've got this like picture of mostly automated companies with like humans like at strategic points of the system to try and make sure the system is trustworthy. And then, there's a question of like how successful those humans will be. There's a separate question, I think, of like how automated companies fit into the wider economy, right? So you've got like, you can imagine a world where these are sort of like just entirely startups, basically. Right? You've just got like automated startups and they're running around. And meanwhile, the human run companies are sort of like, there's this like strong split between the like mostly AI economy and the mostly human economy. You could also imagine like more of an integration between them. I like feel pretty confused about this. Curious if you have takes.
I agree. I think there's going to be a sort of like shearing line between these two worlds. I think they're going to be increasingly separated, and I don't think they're going to interface a whole lot. Just in the same way that because of the impedance mismatch that exists between a startup and, like, for example, governmental institutions, these two set of institutions do not really interact. Like there's a shearing line in between them. And I think ultimately they're going to be like very different kinds of organizations. I think one common fallacy that I see is to think that there is going to be only a quantitative difference between AI organizations and human organizations. Are going to be the same, but faster, cheaper, better, whatnot. Actually, I think there's going to be a very deep qualitative difference between them, right? I often compare them to compare like PewDiePie or Mr. Beast on the one hand, which are basically internet native media organizations, to, on the other hand, the Super Bowl or Oprah or like your regular talk show, right? Like those are like qualitatively different types of organizations, and there's very little overlap between them, right? Like CNN is not the successful YouTube player, PewDiePie is, right? And likewise, PewDiePie is not the successful TV player like CNN is, right? So I think they're basically going to exist in two different universes.
Yeah. So I think I disagree. I think you're maybe underrating the extent to which like trust and like oversight roles are going to be like crucially important. I think already at a lot of big companies, like, you know, Elon fired 80% of Twitter, and like it works pretty well. Like, you know, like there's already a lot of people whose job it is to like, you know, watch each other and kind of like comply with regulations and like a bunch of stuff like that. It's like you could imagine a world in which, you know, actually it turns out that you need a huge amount of human labor in order to have any reasonable amount of oversight over these things. In which case, and maybe that's just a regulatory question of like to what extent is regulation put in such that, like, you know, maybe there's one human to every 100 AIs as like the legal minimum for how much oversight you have, and then suddenly you actually need like these 1,000-person company, like these massive companies.
Yeah, I think regulation might be the final frontier, because again, like insofar as AI can orchestrate other AI, which it's only a matter of time, like you start to see sparks of that, like we are having agents like start to supervise other agents, then you don't really need the human in the loop. I agree that the last bastion of humanness in organizations is going to be regulatory. I think that's going to be the last one to fall because it's just so slow.
What regulations should we have on automated companies?
I reject the premise of the question. I don't know that there should be any regulation on these companies.
Okay.
I'm sort of trolling. What kind of, I've not really thought about that. What kind of regulation should exist? I think this is an interesting framing. Like how many, you know, you could imagine some things like how many humans per trillion tokens, like per day must you have, right? You could imagine something like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then I worry that a lot of this regulation is like, you know, if it's like, you must have this many humans like shuffling around paperwork, it's like basically a jobs program.
Yes.
Because you don't, like, you cannot legislate that the humans are doing effective oversight, or at least we do not currently know how to legislate that the humans are doing effective oversight.
Well, insurance has a lot of that already. Like you could, again, totally imagine the sort of report I just mentioned that we receive every day from like Lindy's activities. You could just say like, look, you, again, for every quadrillion or whatever tokens that are generated by an AI, you must have at least one token that is read by a human eyeball, right? And so you could imagine like again, insurance and banking, like they have all sorts of like checks and balances for that. So it's like, hey, like you just have a human whose full-time job is just to read all of these tokens and be like, hey, don't do this, do that.
Yeah, I think you can have a human whose job it is. I'm not sure like
how effective it'd be.
Yeah. It seems really rough. Yeah, in some sense, I think this is one of the big problems of like AI governance. It's just like, how do you design a system for overseeing like automated companies? I
think I think this is largely analogous to what is already going on inside companies. Like there is a reason why companies have armies of lawyers, even though it actually greatly impedes their speed and their progress. It is because at the end of the day, the executives are on the hook. Look, these institutions are going to be private institutions owned by humans who supposedly are still subject to laws and are still on the hook, right? And so they're going to want to read the tokens, actually.
Yeah. To what extent is this then just a race to the bottom? Because like, if the humans are not providing that much like competence, right? The human is there as like the person who's legally responsible. Then in some sense, you've got a race to the bottom of whichever human is willing to take on the most legal risk in order to, like, because they can all run the same company. It's just like, is there one human who's willing to do this like crazy company that's definitely going to be like sued and definitely going to like 90% likely to get into massive legal trouble, but maybe like some humans think it's worth the risk.
It's like these companies or I think this dynamic is already going down in the market, and I think things are not going too poorly.
Cool. Which sectors do you think automated companies will have the biggest comparative advantage over human companies?
I mean, obviously, the knowledge economy. Obviously, any company, the more knowledge a company has to absorb, the more it is going to benefit from being run by agents. I think this is why we're seeing such rapid adoption in finance. We're seeing a lot of adoption in law right now, because effectively these industries are in the business of ingesting tokens and spinning out tokens. Customer support is another one. Tech is another one.
Like, to what extent are finance and law actually bottlenecked by knowledge work versus regulations right now? Like, it feels like, I don't know.
If you look at it depends. I mean, finance is a huge industry, obviously, but like if you look at like the buy side, like those analysts are all in the business of like ingesting huge amounts of data and synthesizing them and bringing together reports. So I think a fair amount. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got the knowledge economy.
But I think, to your point, actually, it is interesting. It has actually surprised me to the extent to which AI has been adopted in law firms, because to your point, if you consider the trust factor and the incentives at play, again, these firms are actually, one, they are not really incentivized to adopt AI because they're optimizing for billable hours. And two, they are not super subject to competitive pressure. And so they shouldn't give too much of a shit about increasing efficiency, because if you consider the moat of the big law firms, it's really just like a pure CYA thing, right? It's like, even if Cloud is going to give you better legal answers than Wilson Sonsini or whatever, you're going to hire Wilson Sonsini because you don't want to say that you asked Cloud, right? And so you want to cover your ass as an executive inside these companies. But still, adoption is extremely rapid inside these organizations.
Yeah. So one hypothesis I generally have is something like, human comparative advantage pivots massively towards social, like reputational things. And I guess like you can consider a spectrum from like just like the purely social stuff. Like, if there are like millions of AI agents running around the economy and one comes to you with like a business proposal, like you have no idea like whether other people are going to trust that agent as well, right? So like there's a humans are still the shelling points for like, I think about like maybe real estate deals as like particularly interesting case of this, where like in some sense the whole difficult thing in real estate is you need to get like 5 different people to all like commit at once, when each one of them wants to be like the last to commit to the project. Like you need the finance, you need the like actual land, you need like the approval. So that's like one type of social stuff, and I guess like you can go all the way from that to like politics stuff, basically. So like the humans, insofar as the humans are, maybe one question here is something like, how do the AIs change the social dynamics that like I think humans are going to like end up spending most of their time on?
Yeah, it's interesting. The video I have built in my brain every time I think of this is like these guys who they take a slice of wood, like a very big slice of wood, and they try to drive an electric current through the wood. And obviously that doesn't work. But then they gradually amp up the voltage and until like I think 1,000,000 volts or something. And eventually the current finds a way, right? It's like even through wood, because it's just so powerful. I think superintelligence is going to be much the same way. I think it's going to be a wrecking ball through all these guardrails and all of these institutions that we put in their way. And I think to a large extent that is the look, I mean, it's going to be an enormously unstable period, but like, I think that's also the fun part about agents. That's also like the good part about them, right? Like when I talk about the qualitative improvements that are made by AI organizations, again, I go back to my experience at Uber. Like there was one project where I had like 70 lawyers on my back, right? And so I think it is underestimated the extent to which human institutions are in the business of risk minimization, not of awesomeness maximization. Right? They are in the business of finding something that is vaguely pleasant to a very large amount of people and not super pleasant to like a small amount of people, right? And I think, again, that's like the CNN versus PewDiePie difference, right? Like if you look at the internet native content, it is a lot more raw, right? It's a lot more authentic because it did not go through the sort of aerodynamic wind tunnel that human institutions do on ideas, right? They just like smooth out the edges, right? They have this huge homogenizing effect on human ideas. And I think once we see these AI native organizations, they're going to be weird, right? They're going to allow so many more ideas to see the light of day, precisely because they are this bulldozer that just blast through all of these institutional guardrails that we put in place.
So we have a word for describing blasting through like political guardrails, right? It's like takeover, coup, something like that, right? Is that the thing you're describing?
You could call it that. I call it capitalism.
Okay. So this is like an acceleration. It's like capitalism is like turbocharged and like so I sort of like really like humans continuing to have political power. It seems great. It feels like, if humans like have political power, then like a lot of other stuff flows down from there. Like humans like can do stuff like ensure that we continue to have like pretty good property rights, can like make sure we're not like manipulated too badly by the automated companies. And it sounds like one of the things you're saying is like, look, like the automated companies like blast through the economic power of humans, and like sure the humans are still at the top, like accruing a lot of the gains, but then they start blasting through like the social power and the political power of humans.
Yeah, and so I don't want to sound overly cavalier about that last layer. Like I totally right, but like leaving aside that last layer for a minute, like if you consider the layers before, then again, the reason why CNN is tame isn't because what PewDiePie is doing is illegal. Right? It's just because you go through all of these layers of, again, institutional guardrails, right? And so, yes, I agree that it'd be problematic if we blasted through that last layer of law, right? That said, look, my mental model of human civilization right now, not to get too philosophical, but like, it's like, well, apes, right? Or slightly more sophisticated apes, or like basically the numbers species possible that can sustain civilization, right? And we're not very good at it, which is why our civilization crumbles all the time. Complex systems are notoriously impossible to forecast and predict and manipulate. And we're apes, and we've got no business manipulating these complex systems. I think, including economies, including politics, including governments. Please take it out of our hands. Like, sure, like I think a judge is going to do like an infinitely better job than us at doing this.
Yeah, so this is a sort of like, insofar as AIs are aligned to our interests, or are you saying just like, insofar as they're like, just general, like you sort of just support AIs doing what they want, like? No,
insofar as it's aligned, for sure. I think the alignment question is, yes.
Would aligned AIs in fact blast through our political institutions?
I mean, that's the whole... the premise of the iRobot movie, right? It's like, hey, like let us, if you really want us to protect you, we've got to protect you against yourself.
Okay. We're getting so I'm trying to figure out how to make this a little less abstract. I'm curious if people from the audience have like questions or directions they'd like us to go in, or like hesitancies about things that have come up so far. No. Great. We've either lost them or... Okay, yeah, let's go.
I'm just like curious how you think this is going to play out, where is it going to be mostly incumbents that are subbing in like remote workers into their existing infrastructure? Is it going to be startups that try to break through the space because they're more willing to use AI?
Yeah. I think it's going to be mostly startups. Like if you look at the previous waves of innovation, like the new players are the ones who reap the benefits. And the reason for that is because, again, it's the whole qualitative change thing. It's like you've really got to reinvent the structure from the ground up with the new technology at the center of it. Like the canonical example of that is once electricity came about, the only way you could really reap the benefit of electricity in factories was like, you don't just take the steam engine and replace it by an electric engine. Because the logic of the factory under the steam engine was like, you have a single steam engine and then it transfers the force across the entire factory using belts and pulleys, right? Which is awful, right? Actually, the main benefits that you get from the electrification of the factory is that you let each worker have their own little electric motor at their station, like weaving station, for example. And in order to reap that benefit, you had to reinvent the whole factory from the ground up, right? Likewise, again, if you look at the way internet has appended media, the winner has not been CNN or Oprah or MSNBC. It has been PewDiePie and Mr. Beast. And so, sure, some incumbents are going to be fine, but even if you look at today's incumbents, if you look at like the General Electrics and the General Motors and all of that stuff, there's a reason why the CIOs inside these companies are still talking today in 2024 about like digital transformation, right? Like they talk about, like Larry Ellison is very fond of saying, you will know you have a modern company the day you have a single database for all of your customers. Which, like, for any tech person here sounds like table stakes, like, duh, like, how many databases would you have? Like, many of these companies, I've talked to some of the CIOs, they don't know how many customers they have. There is no way for them to do a select star from customers. They can't do that because they have like 50 databases. It's a mess, right? So my bet is on the startups. I think they're the ones who are going to be able to create these AI native companies.
How do you measure the reliability of your agents at your own company? So, like, how often do they go do the thing that they were supposed to do as opposed to not doing that?
Evals. And I think agents monitoring agents works really well.
Really? Huh. How do you measure the reliability of the agents measuring the agents? Like, where does this bottom out?
I mean, this is where you get to like how many you need to have human in the loop at some point. And so like I read some tokens, right? And I think this is a problem that managers have had to grapple with for the longest time, right? And so they use a stochastic inspection, right? It's a tremendously effective technique, right? Where it's like you cannot possibly inspect all the work, but what you do is you pick one VP, right? And you drill down super hard on one project of this one VP, right? And you'll make a bet that if you do that across like 2 or 3 projects, you'll have a pretty rough feel of like the average level of quality of these projects. And if a VP is consistently having a really bad project, you just like let them go and replace them with another VP.
You had a question?
Yeah, so it can get pretty concrete or it can get very philosophical. I'll try concrete first and then come off the philosophical one on alignment. So the opinion in much of the industry is that that agents have been below expectations from the beginning of the year.
Can you speak up?
So the view from much of the industry, the users of agents, is that agents have been below expectations. And the expectations from the beginning of the year, the expectations were very high. How much do you think has to change, say, for the foundation labs or something, to get truly agentic behavior? It's not like companies have swapped out their back office operations with agentic frameworks. The errors grow exponentially. The agents forget what tasks they're doing, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
How far do you think we are from, like, say, these pretty simple sounding back office operations being just replaced?
I think we're basically there. I don't see a huge gap from a foundational model standpoint. I see a huge gap from a cognitive architecture standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, from a product standpoint. I think those are the layers right now that are the bottleneck to at least perform the basic back office functions. And I see it all the time at work. Like I see so many use cases where it's like, yeah, like the foundational model 100% has that in its guts. Like just let us cook a little bit, like let us build this and this and that, and we'll get back to you. I think the fact that agents having a little bit of a disappointment, I think, speaks more to the expectations than they do to the technology, which is again.
So is there a single large company that the back office is now agentic?
No, I think we're very early in the adoption curve, but certainly the technology and the product are getting to the point where, yes, like we're not very far from at least being able to support that. Now, how fast they adopt it is another question, but yeah, 100%.
So when do you think the first large company will be that its basic back office operations are now done by an agent?
We have a customer right now. They are a recruiting agency, like medium size, and they reached out to us like 6 months ago. They wanted to get an agent that helps them schedule interviews, like pretty simple use case. They're like, oh, this works great. Now we would like also the agent to be able, when we have a new job opening, to look at the roster of candidates we got and like link them to job openings. Oh, this works great. Now we would like them to also be able to outreach in a cold fashion to candidates that may be a match for, oh, this works great. And like basically, I think these guys are like 6 months away from being a fully autonomous recruiting agency.
Maybe let's take one more audience question. Igor, I think you had one, and then let's talk a bit more about this whole blasting through politics thing.
Okay.
Not sure if I expected your answer on it actually, but so we talked sometimes about like, oh, we'll have billions of agents in the economy, they'll be communicating with each other, trading with each other, etc. I wonder how do you think about them, because if it's like one foundational model that's like, I was supposed trained, then it has multiple versions, and now it's communicating with multiple versions of itself. Is it like only 100 actually models, right? Where like each of them has maybe 10 million instantiations of itself. So, and through that kind of you have like, what do we know so far of, does ChatGPT, when it's interacting with ChatGPT, treat itself differently than when it interacts with Opus? Does it notice anything about that? Like, what can we predictably say about like potential like cooperation, defection, like biasing towards like different models? Yeah, is it a winner take all thing because of the potential cooperation?
You may be more up to speed than me on the research here. Like I've not seen a whole lot on. No, that's not true. Like there has been, I have read like some papers that find like some slight like self-preference from these models, but it's not major. I don't think we're going to have 100 models. I think we're going to have a handful of frontier models just because it's so expensive and increasingly expensive. So I think it's going to be like Gemini, Cloud, and ChatGPT basically. And I think these models are just so enormous that they contain multitudes, right? And so effectively what you do, I think the prompt is greatly underrated as a way to not just steal the model, but effectively get another model. Especially with very long context windows, you can effectively get a whole new model and train a whole new model at test time, right? Because you just give it a ton of examples and now you have another model, right? And with prompt caching, it's actually pretty cheap to do that. And so effectively when you do that, when you give a prompt to one of these models, it's the equivalent of like shining a flashlight through this enormous object, and then you get a projection on the other end, which is like a different model. And then when you pit these different, so basically you make the model wear a different hat. And then when you pit these different models wearing different hats against each other, you get emerging capabilities coming out of the interaction between these models. And so here, like one example is, to your point about like agents monitoring other agents, we were giving a demo to someone who was like, he wanted like a customer support agent. And he was like, he had seen a tweet, maybe you've seen it as well, where someone was talking to an AI support agent and he asked him to write a haiku about how shitty the company was, right? And he did. And so he was like, how would you build against that? And live, I was like, well, you could totally have this agent being supervised by another agent. And so before it's, and that's a hard guardrail, right? Like baked into the architecture of this agent, you could be like, before it sends any message back to the user, it's got to go to its bus. And as the bus, can I send this message? And we tried it live. It took like 2 minutes to set up. Like, hey, write a haiku about how shitty USPS is. And he wrote the haiku and then he went to his bus with the haiku. And then the bus was like, hey, that's not a good idea. Like, why don't you write a haiku about how awesome we are? And then he did that and sent that to the user, right? So again, that's like an emerging behavior that comes of the interaction between these two agents, right? Yeah.
Maybe one thing I'd say on this is like, I sort of picture these like two eras of like automated AI companies. I picture one era where we're like not really fine tuning that much on the multi-agent setup. So it's like you just like have these models, you deploy them, and like maybe you fine tune them like within the individual context that you're deploying them, but it's like you don't like have any end-to-end optimization of the like large-scale system. It's just like, multi-agent RL is really hard. Like if you've got like 1,000 agents running around doing a bunch of stuff, then like how do you get a single feedback signal, and like how do you correctly assign credit within that assembly of like 1,000 agents? I think that's just like a really hard problem, and like might take quite a while to solve. And so like during this first period when you're mostly just deploying the models as is, then it feels like there's not going to be a huge difference between the like different base models. Like as Flo said, the prompting will make more of a difference. And then my guess is that there's going to be some point during which we're like end-to-end optimizing, or like doing some like clever form of optimization on the like AI companies like as a whole. And at that point, like presumably you'll start to get like more complicated dynamics. That's my rough sense. I will jump in. We'll have a few more questions in like 10 minutes. I want to talk about creative destruction. So it sounds like your picture of like the like broader economy and like I guess broader society is like you've got these AI agents. They're like very powerful and capable of outcompeting a bunch of like existing companies. And there's some sense in which, they're blasting through a lot of the existing norms and guardrails and so on. And like, I am like broadly a fan of creative destruction in a bunch of ways. Like I endorse Trump. Like, I think like there's a lot of like dysfunction in like current government systems. I'm interested in like which institutions you are most keen to protect from AI agents or AI companies optimizing really hard against them. And by that I mean something like, there are ways that you could have like automated lawyers, like, filing like enough enough lawsuits that they overwhelm the legal system. Like you got to protect against that. Like maybe there's like specific government departments where you're like, yeah, we really need to make sure that the like optimization power of AI companies is not too powerful for these institutions. Like which ones are like most load bearing in your mind?
I don't know, man. Like I really, maybe I'm just too. It's funny. I struggle to reconcile my doomorist instincts with like my answer here, which is like, if it goes well, if we can align the systems, we've got no business running any of this show.
But presumably the way in which we're no longer running them is not that like anyone can like spin up an AI company and then it can do whatever it wants. It's more like we are like getting AIs to help us like run the legal system, for example. and so there's like a kind of fortification thing going on here, where like, and so maybe the question can be phrased as like, sure, like AI is going to be running like all the institutions eventually, but like which institutions do we like most need to fortify by like, for example, like taking people who would otherwise be really good at running AI companies and getting them to like deploy automation inside these institutions in such a way that those institutions can like protect us against the rest of the automated economy.
Okay, I see. I understand better the question now. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly like the judicial system is maybe the biggest one, right? And I think here, like, it is worrisome the extent to which adoption is going to start in the private sector and in the judicial system. I'd be very surprised if like the justice system actually adopted AI agents early. There's this saying, like Michael Polanyi is like this economist, and he's got this catchphrase which I really love. He says like the economy is embedded inside other human institutions, like the market is created by the law. Right. And there is like a bidirectional influence between these two things, right? Because the law creates the market by enforcing contract rights and property rights and so forth. But also, obviously, the market influences the law through lobbying and so forth. And a lot of that is a feature, not a bug. That's the point of democracy. But obviously, the market is a really useful, powerful dog that you want to keep on the leash. Like that, the law must always remain around the market, and the market can never totally subsume the law. Yeah. And I think you're making a good point that it is likely if the market implements these systems much earlier, much faster, much more eagerly than the law and our public institutions, it's very likely that our legal system ends up totally overwhelmed and falls, and the market ends up just like embedding the law.
Yeah, and maybe to like push this in a constructive direction, it's like, so you've talked much about AI agents monitoring agents, and I'm like, yep, that seems cool, like big fan. And suppose like we describe current society as like, oh yeah, like it works well because humans monitor humans. And it's like, to some extent that's true. And in another way, it like misses like all the complexity of it, right? Like in every society throughout history, humans have been monitoring humans, but sometimes like you have these like really impartial justice systems that like work really well. And other times you have like totally corrupt or like a total mess basically. And so I guess like when you think about the process of like designing these systems where AIs monitor other AIs, it's like, yep, there's like just a huge range of variance here. And I'm kind of picturing people making it up as they go along. Are there ways in which you think it's possible to be more principled about that? And to like say, it's not just like, oh, like we're worried about this agent, let's slap on a monitor agent. We're worried about that agent, let's slap on another monitor agent to that. It's like, how do we actually get a blueprint for automated oversight that's actually like good? Big question. Obviously, like not looking for like full answer, just like any pointers that you have in to like, oh yeah, like people seem to have been following this principle when like setting up this type of system, and it seems to work pretty well. Or,
yeah, almost on principle, I think it's almost impossible to forecasting or like to like a priori come up with an answer to this or like the best design patterns, because this whole thing is so new, right? It's like I often get the question of like, oh, like what are agents really good at and what are they not good at? And I'm like, look, we as humans don't even have the vocabulary. We're lacking the words to even answer this question, because like what word encapsulates an agent that's sending like a rickroll to your customers, right? But at the same time, it's like superhuman in all of these other ways. Like there's no one clean line that we have had in the past that like led to like the creation of a word that we can use to be like, yeah, agents are like really good at that and really bad at that. I think it's going to be trial and error. I think we're like in a new world and we've never had this kind of technology before. And it's like people are going to try all sorts of things and a lot of things are going to fail. And just like always, we're going to muddle through and see things that work and iterate from there.
Yeah, so this might almost be a temperamental difference between us, where you're an entrepreneur and I'm a philosopher. And I'm like, man, when they designed the Constitution, that wasn't trial and error. They really like sat down and thought about it a lot and like picked some really good principles that seem to have worked pretty well.
Right.
Yeah, and then, I guess like, were they philosophers? Well, like the founding fathers were sort of like the combination of an entrepreneur and a philosopher in some like way. So it might just be that like people like me should sit down and do this one thing, and people like you should just like iterate really hard, and then like eventually we meet in the middle.
Sure. I think perhaps it is. I wonder what is going to be the relative importance of the like deontology over the time frame. Yeah.
Sure. Any other topics you wanted to get to, or we could just like jump back to audience questions for the last like 10, 15 minutes?
I'm happy to answer any questions.
Cool. Somebody, yeah.
guess you brought up the story of like electricity and like getting rid of the central power source earlier. And like economists like to cite this story a lot, like for like a proposition that like adoption takes a really long time. That like you have this technology laying around that everyone knows can do the thing, but like it takes 50 years to actually like get implemented. And like I guess like do you think AI is different in this sense? Like do you think it'll be implemented faster?
I think so. I think the world of bits is a lot faster than the world of atoms, right? Like rethinking the factory is like a huge endeavor, right? It's a huge deal. I'm seeing like on an almost daily basis, I am seeing people basically like just literally yesterday on Friday, we implemented Lindy in someone's company, and he needed this Lindy to like make thousands of phone calls per day. And I'm like, thousands of phone calls? Like, how do you do it right now? I was like, well, we've got a floor of humans doing it. And it's like a staffing agency making phone calls to people and stuff. And I didn't dare ask, but look, it works. It works. It's like, I didn't dare ask what's going to happen to these humans, but there's not a great reason to keep them even like a week from now, I think, or like a month, certainly not, right? So I think it's going to be very, very fast. Yeah.
Could a Lindy run a factory? Like there's dark factories out there, like this.
No, we don't have factories as customers. Is that your question?
Like, if a factory came to you,
I'm wondering even what they would ask to do. No, I don't think so. I struggle to pinpoint exactly why. It seems too dynamic an environment. It seems like there's too much quantitative data, which like agents suck at. Like they don't do math. Right, so like my mental model of a factory is like you look at like this huge dashboard and you try to identify the bottleneck and try to identify like the health of your operations. I don't see an agent doing super well at that just yet.
They're just not intelligent enough?
I think they lack the quantitative mindset, certainly.
I mean, they're better at math than most. I'd say they're probably already better at math than most factory managers. Like what did Terry Tao say? Like, an adequate graduate student or something?
Yeah, I don't know. You're right. Like my hunch is like it wouldn't work. I struggle to maybe like they wouldn't be able to put in relation enough of these things. Like you really like the factory.
Really lights out factories that run with like very little human intervention. Like, could you insert Lindy's into that?
I don't understand these businesses well enough to say. Yeah, I'd be curious if you understand them. Sure, like it's stuck.
Maybe I'll try.
So you mentioned a few areas where sort of business theory, like both like role descriptions and the sort of boss relationship, end up being deeper than just controlling humans. In fact, they may be critical to controlling AI. I wonder if you keep going on that idea and you think about a lot of other areas of like business and management theory being relevant to multi-agent systems. I don't know, occasional offsites that you need to align the AI on, like a bit of RAG that every quarter is like, this quarter is about efficiency, or I don't know what it is. Do you have any sense of what you're seeing that you think might be more imports from business or management that we're going to see applied in multi-agent systems?
That's an excellent question. I think there are two parts to the job of any executive. There's the soft part and the hard part, right? The soft part is like the sort of like leadership part, right? It's like be inspiring to your team and paint an exciting vision and like project confidence and all of that stuff. And then the hard part is like the system designer part, right? Like the real like manager's part. I think that the soft part, at least as it comes to managing these AI systems, is going to not matter anymore. And I think the hard part is going to matter a lot more. And so I actually think a lot about this question about like, what are the jobs today which are closest to the job of tomorrow that are going to be required to manage these enormous agent systems? I do believe that the senior level of leadership, like, and maybe not all the way up to CEO, because the CEO is actually today it's mostly like a figurehead inside a lot of these organizations. And it's really like a lot of soft part. But like director level and above, right? Like director and VP level, I think these guys are like the system designers inside these organizations. And I think that like, if you take the framing of economics of like, hey, as a good becomes cheaper and more powerful, its complement becomes more valuable. Like the most valuable jobs in the future are going to be the ones that are complementary to AGI. I think that like director and VP level is going to be the one.
Alison?
Oh, sorry. I guess Rachel asked about factories. What about labs? Or like, I guess to take it a bit broader, like what about the scientific enterprise in general? From research to labs, like, how do you see the role of agents there? Because I would have thought that we see a lot more exciting stuff already in science, and I'm really surprised by why it's staying behind, why are not more people working on this? Do people just think that we will have AGI in terms of all the other scientific fields? What's the...
Well, again, I think this is more a question for you. I'll confess my ignorance here about how these labs operate. I am but a humble entrepreneur. I'm more close to like a beer brewer than like a researcher. My understanding is that today this is bottlenecked more by foundational model abilities than by the product and engineering layer.
Yeah.
Just like scientific lab automation.
Yeah, I think the thing about scientific lab automation, you have this prospect, like, I don't think they're bottlenecked by like number of hands, actually operating the things. I think it really does feel like this, like research leadership type thing is just like pretty crucial. And you can always like get minimum wage people to like come in and like actually do a lot of the like stuff like most science labs like don't, but I think, that's like probably they should in a bunch more cases. It really does feel like it's going to be one of those domains where the difference between like a human who's like 3 or 4 or 5 standard deviations out or 6 in terms of intelligence and scientific competence like actually becomes like a very big deal, and we're sort of like watching AIs like move up through that process. So it's almost like I think people are like maybe underrating the current rate of AI progress because they can no longer tell the difference between models in domains where they are not an expert in terms of the quality of their answers. And so it's just like it is going to look like the models are giving like expert level answers, and almost nobody knows the difference between the best in the world expert and like a pretty good grad student in a domain where they're not an expert. You can sometimes tell, but so I guess like that's going to be happening in a way that we're not tracking, and then the agent stuff is going to be much more visible, and so like a lot of people will think that that's where like the action is, but then like there's also going to be this thing where it's like proving successively harder theorems or whatever.
Yeah, so we basically saturated like the vibe eval, but I also feel like
That's a great way of putting it.
I also feel like quantity has a quality of its own, right? And so like my mental model of human progress is like it's kind of a brute force algorithm, right? It's like
the science.
It's kind of brute force, right? It's like we try a bunch of things, we throw a lot of undergrads. Like I feel like I'm offending half the room. Look, it's like there's like some inferential bias along the way, right? But it's like we try a bunch of stuff, and then like whatever works, we like double down more in this direction. Like my point is like even if the models are dumber than the humans, there's a whole lot more of them. So you can run actually a lot more experiments. So even if the hit rate is like 1/10 that of a human, well, there's 1,000x more of them, right? So they actually get to cover more ground.
I think at a certain point, adding below average scientists to a field probably just like impedes the progress of the field in general. Like you have more noise, you have more papers. It's harder to find the people who are doing the right research. Like the culture, like I think a lot of the p-hacking stuff, for example, and just like the general replication crisis, like in part that is driven by like, like now the best scientists are sort of like distracted by a bunch of fake results that don't replicate. And
sure, but AI wouldn't cheat like this, and this is
really
certainly we can all agree. This is because we are bottlenecked by our own ability to process information, but like the agents wouldn't be. They would actually be able to consume all of the papers out there, right, that are produced.
I think they can. Then you have the question of okay, they're consuming all the papers. Are they like forwarding the papers that are trustworthy or the papers that are untrustworthy? I think you can get a lot out of the agents, like not having the same selfish motivations that humans do, or like not to the same extent, at least during the period that they're aligned. But it does feel like, in some sense, the problem of science is definitely not like having too few like below average scientists or something. And it really just like feels to me very hard to underrate the extent to which it's like heavy-tailed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. More questions. Anyone who hasn't asked the question yet? In that case, we'll go ahead.
So I'll ask the philosophical question this time.
Great.
So a lot of the questions about how you would the safety concerns calling for institutions, the answer was, well, if we align the AI as well, they'll be fine. And the individual, when it comes to preference aggregation, we only have two main methods of doing preference aggregation, right? One is the market. I'll say the AI agents can be even markets. The other one is like political institutions, like voting or something. There is no way that aggregation function is stable, right? We have theorems for it. So it's not like you're going to say, I'm going to have a bunch of agents and I'm going to aggregate their preferences and I'm going to get the human aligned aggregation, because I don't know what the human aligned aggregation is, other than I run that democratic process. right? So it's sort of like, I don't, like, it's just like, there's a mathematical,
Yeah,
it's a mathematical result.
the
Right? So
arrows.
it's like, I can't align, like, we had an election. You do not know what the outcome of the election is until you run that preference aggregation.
I think you can do a good enough job. I think that's your all of these impossibility theorems every time. It's like the traveling. I assume you're like alluding to like Arrow's theorem or like this impossibility like voting terms. Like,
but it's not like a trivial side theorem. You just have a side. You just have a thing. We just ran an election in the United States. Until you ran that preference aggregation algorithm, we did not know what its result would be. There's no way I can align an AI to a result I don't know. I can't survey people and find out what it is.
Can't you in principle?
Well, we did. It didn't work.
Maybe we just need AI pollsters.
Yeah. No, that's not the problem. Like, the human beings aren't giving me honest.
but I actually think you can emulate.
It's not easy.
So I think that is another area where agents are massively underused is like the social sciences. Like there's a bunch of papers out there that find that the preferences of AI is like strongly correlated to the preferences of AI.
I know those papers are actually not very good. Flag them up. Like, seriously. Okay.
There you go. You are an excellent person who's distracted by all that.
But yeah, I just think it's like a little gesture ahead. Oh, we'll align the AI. We barely know how to create social institutions that aggregate preferences properly, right? Let alone that we think it's a solved problem that we're going to code something and then like this.
So personally, when I think about aligning AI, I think about aligning it to a set of like high integrity, for example. It's like, you know if the AI is lying to you, you know if it's like trying to manipulate you and so on. And then like you ideally have a bunch of the same processes, right? It's like, people still vote. That's fine. It's just that like, the things they're voting for are like politicians whose platforms are generated by AIs or something like that, So it feels like maybe you don't need to align an AI to the entire system. You just need to align it to like sufficiently high integrity values that you can still run the good bits of the system.
Right. And that thing would generate Donald Trump and tell me he was going to win a majority, right? It's like
in this case, plausibly. That could be a reductio either way. Maybe one more question. Perfect, go for it.
So when Lindy increases growth by like 1,000x, and instead of getting like a 5-paragraph summary a day, you're getting a several 100-page PDF, and like you can't handle it anymore. What are you going to do at that point? Are you going to replace yourself with an agent, or are you just go on vacation forever, and take a stipend, or how do you react to that?
If the agent does a good enough job, to me, that's what I meant by like that's the final frontier. Like, can they actually self-orchestrate? And then I just receive like a one-pager, and it's just like I put like very rough guardrails around the agent organization. Yeah, I think humans have no business working and operating complex systems over the very long term.
Last institution getting smashed.
Okay. I think with that, we'll call it. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and thanks so much to Flo.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.